Stella's journey was darker than I ever expected it to be. After seeing the trailer, I wasn't expecting such expansive character work with a compelling story from a live-action Disney film that doesn't end with a giant fight scene. The story was gripping, the character development for the most part was interesting, and the fashion world on display was something completely new that I'm not used to seeing. Even though this film blew me away compared to what my expectations were, a few aspects were a bit lackluster. But before I get into the gritty details, I'm going to be exploring the fashion world with a character balancing the sides of good and evil against all odds, but to give in all the same with Cruella. What really stood out to me here, beyond just having good characters, was the story's structure. Stella works for the woman Baroness, and as she works for her, she starts to realize that she's the one who killed her mother, the guilt of her death on her shoulders, with all that pain coming full circle with the truth being revealed. The pain and cruelty that Cruella began to represent over time now takes over as the dominant personality for Stella. The film plays with this duality a lot. The idea that instead of a character being both their good and bad qualities, Stella sort of separates them. The more timid and caring side, contrasted with the mean, kinda evil side. The progression of becoming like the person she hates. Treating her newfound family just like the Baroness treats her underlings was pretty effective, though it wasn't followed through all that well, which is a trend for this movie. The weakest parts of the story for me was the ending. It kinda just ends, without Cruella really growing past her weaknesses, which the movie clearly shows she knows about. This doesn't ruin the film, but it does weaken it for me. The best parts of the movie, though, were easily the character interactions, with Stella and the Baroness, the gang working together to steal stuff. These moments worked the best. Everyone had a lot of depth to their character, and nobody felt too one-dimensional. Also, the costume and set designs were stunning. I'm not super fashion savvy, but I was not expecting to be so intrigued and excited about the artistry here. The middle part of this story was so interesting because of the art world setting, and Stella improving her craft. Obviously, the film's about a lot more than a girl trying to make it in the fashion world, but it was nice to see nonetheless. A mark of good writing is allowing your world building to be expansive, without it needing to be right in your face at every second. The world was coated by the fashion experience. Every place they went to had its own fashion sense. I have to praise the film designers for their work here. Before I talk about the parts that don't work as well for me, I have to talk about the discussion surrounding these villain-centric films. Outside of just this movie, the writing and culture around villain characters has been changing over the last decade in the mainstream. Traditionally, characters tend to be good or evil without much in between, at least when it comes to major properties in mainstream storytelling. As time goes on, villains have become to be anything but pure evil. I've seen the complaints everywhere about this so-called trend. Why can't a villain just be evil? Or why does every villain need to be sympathetic? Are some of the common ones. I think there's a misconnection between these statements. When a film with a sympathetic villain like Infinity War, for example, comes out, then it's praised as having a deep antagonist. But when a movie comes out that isn't as good with a sympathetic or even complicated villain, it's criticized for trying to capitalize on the trend. I think the complaints have been misplaced. It's hard to say a sympathetic or ambiguous antagonist is worse than a simple black and white mustache twirling antagonist. Of course, each type of character can have its place in any kind of story, but just because you can understand the antagonist doesn't make it a part of a trope. Deeper characters are ones with multiple layers to their personality and story. A purely evil character for the most part is someone who has very little character development, not much depth, and serves one specific focus. Mustache twirling villains become more of plot devices for the story rather than characters. Like Palpatine from Star Wars. He can be fun to watch on screen, sure, but for the most part, he isn't much of a character. He tends to be mentioned in these types of discussions as an example of a purely evil villain type that people miss seeing in movies, but I never considered him that great of a villain, at least when compared to Darth Vader, who is a more complicated gray antagonist. Palpatine isn't very interesting. Sympathetic antagonist stories aren't just having a villain that's also a good person, but a story with someone who you can in some ways understand. A mark of any good story is making sure both sides of a conflict are well established, so the storytelling isn't left lopsided. When a villain is given a backstory, sympathetic or understandable motivations, interesting character quirks, personality, it improves their character, which brings us back to Cruella and other sympathetic villains. It seems many of the complaints for these types of characters and stories are geared more towards Disney compared to other studios. Thanos, the Flag Smashers, Vulture, Mysterio, Killmonger. All these antagonists fit into the category of having sympathetic qualities, motivations, and/or having an understandable goal. But aside from all of them in some way being relatable or understandable, these characters are nothing alike at all. They all have different driving goals, different plans, and they each value different things. Thanos cares about the balance of the universe because of his people's fate. Vulture cares about having work and providing for his family. Killmonger wants to liberate black people around the the world. They are very loosely in the same group. Strong writing is about having competent characters that have enough depth to feel real. When making a character have any kind of depth, it means exploring who they are and why they do what they do. Understanding is inevitable with more complex characters, but that doesn't mean they are all sympathetic, or even have to be. As a viewer, Mysterio's actions are understandable. It makes sense how he got to where he is now, but that doesn't mean he's sympathetic. Aside from the one scene where he talks about Tony insulting his life's work, all this isn't to say it doesn't ever make sense for a character to just be completely evil, by any means. There are tons of antagonists that fulfill their role amazingly, even without the nuances of good and evil. It's important when assessing characters to know when one is supposed to be sympathetic and when they're meant to be understood. One example of this would be Joker 2019. He's meant to be a character you sympathize with, not because of the actions he ultimately takes, and the dark road he goes down, but for what got him to that point. It can be very easy for certain people to write off the film, because of how much the story clashes with their view on the world, or because they don't like how the story treats the main character's actions. But the point of the story is really to study the character of Joker. When you look at him as a whole, who is he? What did the world do to push him down this road? These aspects are important because it helps shift the focus from whether he becomes a villain or not to what his journey tells us about his world. You don't have to agree with what he does, but the world isn't black and white, and everyone gets to certain points differently. Bit of a tangent, but the point is, antagonists are made better with complexity. When it comes to the trend in movies to have sympathetic characters though, I can understand where some people are coming from. With Cruella, it's so strange to change who she is, as a character, to make a prequel movie. This movie might as well not be about Cruella, and just some new character not based on anything else, because of how different she is. This movie definitely goes for the sympathetic angle, and it doesn't work the whole way through. Cruella's mad personality is not justified and ends up just being an excuse for her shitty behavior. Around halfway through, she starts giving into her Cruella personality, and it doesn't work. When she was younger, the split personality angle with Stella and Cruella was mostly about her being rude or uncaring of other people. The only reason she stopped being this way is because her mother told her to, but now it takes on a different meaning. Not only is her Cruella personality mean and uncaring, but she also has a mad, chaotic aspect to her. The film never gives any reason to believe her being this way is good at all. The entire film shows how her cruelty was working against her. At one point in the film, she even proves it to herself by saying she was going to be exactly like the Baroness but better, and not better in character, but more successful, while having the exact same personality as her. At first I thought this would be okay, because the point of the story could be her turn to the dark side, how she ends up pushing everyone she loves away, because she gave into her dark side, and became just like the person who killed her mother. Sort of a Batman not killing because he doesn't want to be Joe Chill sort of situation. But that isn't how the story goes. She later apologizes, and understands how wrong she was for acting the way she did, a turning point where she begins to accept both sides of her personality to try and move forward. But that entire scene was rendered null and void when she creates a plan to frame her own death as Stella, to then fully embrace her Cruella de Vil personality. Again, there is a point in the movie where Cruella recognizes that this part of her personality is just like a murderous, cruel fashion designer that is willing to murder everyone including her own children. The story somehow acknowledges the flaw within her character, while simultaneously trying to justify who she has become, which doesn't make sense. I enjoyed large parts of this movie, but the worst part of it was the split personality angle. I don't even understand why her character was written this way. Acting mean and cruel isn't the same as becoming some other personality. It's weirdly creating a defense for any actions the character takes, because her bad side can be blamed for it. It's a shift of blame from herself to herself, but more unhinged, like that means anything different. In theory, I don't dislike this idea, but with how the movie portrays it, it comes across as a cop-out excuse for being a bad person. Aside from these overall smaller issues I had, this was a really enjoyable film. The writing and in particular character work was really damn good. I was not expecting the dialogue to be so tightly written for a Disney remake like this, though to be fair, I really enjoyed Maleficent as well, so they are in a roll with these villain reimagining stories, so long as you ignore Maleficent too. What'd you think of the film? Did you like it? Was it better than you were expecting? Are the current trends with villains getting to you, or are you all for it? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed, like and check out the playlist for more content like this. I hope to see you next time.